So why is this case important? Well, it's important because of what the Shelleys did, as well as Mr. Bush and his conspiracy of heroes, we are able to live wherever we want to, so long as we can afford it. And while, yes, I don't deny that there's still a racial caste system within our communities, but as far as that being allowed legally, de jure segregation in that way is no longer permitted. And that's because of this case. What's up, everyone? It's me, Brooke. Welcome back to the Untold Stories of the Civil Rights Movement, my little series where I look at what I think are some of the most important civil rights cases. I discuss them, break them down, and let you know why I think they're important. You ready for week 13? Lucky 13. Let's go. This week, we're looking at the 1948 Supreme Court case Shelley versus Kraemer, which deals with restrictive covenants. Now, if you're not familiar with that, generally speaking, they're kind of what they sound like. They restricted who you could sell your property to. And often it was, you can't sell your property to black people if you are within a particular neighborhood. And it's the way that neighborhoods were able to be segregated and sort of relegate black people. And in this case, actually, the restrictive covenant involved not just black, but Mongolian or Asian people to particular areas of town which were less affluent, and restricted black people to the more rundown areas of town. So let's get into the facts, shall we? Of course. So the facts of this case involves a man named J.D. Shelley, who moved up with his family from Mississippi to St. Louis, Missouri. And in St. Louis, Missouri, he did work during the war efforts, building parts for the war. Then afterwards, he worked in construction. But his family of 9, so it's a nice size family that they had going there, they were finding that their 3-bedroom apartment was just too small, and he wanted to find something bigger for his family. Unfortunately, because of the restrictive covenants and other discriminatory laws, they weren't able to move just anywhere. They could only move in like the black part of town. So J.D. Shelley really wanted to find a nice area for his family. The Ville was a nice black area of town, but he was on a wait list. He couldn't get in. He couldn't get into one of the homes. Again, because of the restrictive covenants, he was limited. And it really came to a head when one of his daughters were injured in, I think it was a robbery or roughed up some kind of way. And so he was very frustrated, but he wanted to get his family moved into a nicer area that really accommodated. Like I said, it was a big family, a family of 9. What ended up happening is that a well-to-do, a very prominent black realtor named James Bush found out about J.D. Shelley's situation and wanted to help him out. So what Mr. Bush did was assemble what he later called a conspiracy of heroes that included 4 other people. One was this a high school teacher, a very well-respected high school teacher, a minister, and then a white woman who was named Josephine Fitzgerald, who was married to a Cuban man who years earlier was killed because of his ethnicity. But she, and then of course J.D. Shelley and then Bush, so there was 5 of them. They got together and they decided, okay, Bush saw this piece of property that was for sale in the white area that had restrictive covenant, but he wanted to be able to give that to Mr. Shelley. So he conspired with this group of 5, and they decided to have Miss Fitzgerald, the white woman, buy the property essentially as a straw person. She bought the property and then immediately sold it to Mr. Shelley, or gave it to Mr. Shelley. That was the plan. They executed the plan well, and it went over well. And the first night the Shelley family was in the house, the daughter said, I thought we died and went to heaven. It was just so beautiful. Nice 2-story home for the family with enough space for them. And everything was fine until the neighbor down the street, Mr. Kraemer, noticed them there. At first he thought they were just renters, but when he realized that they actually owned the home, he got upset. Now this man lived like 10 blocks away, so he's just all up in their business. But he got upset and got with the community improvement organization, and they sued, essentially asking for an injunction to kick the Shelleys out of their neighborhood because they said it violated the restrictive covenant for that community. The case, the judge there, Judge Kraemer, he eventually, at the trial level, he said, no. In order for this covenant to have been enforced, you would have needed all the people who were there to sign it, and you only had 30 out of the 39 homes or homeowners there who signed this agreement. Therefore, he didn't deal on the constitutionality of the restrictive covenant, but said because you guys didn't have this kind of technical thing, your T's weren't crossed, your I's weren't dotted, therefore you can't enforce it. The Shelleys get to stay. The Shelleys were ecstatic. They were happy. Also at this time, they elicited the the help of one of the most prominent African-American lawyers in town, George Vaughn. And so they were happy, but then their joy was short-lived because in due time, they appealed the case to the Missouri Supreme Court, and the Missouri Supreme Court overruled that and said, no, they can't enforce this restrictive covenant. And, essentially ruled that the Shelleys would have to leave. So obviously they were disappointed. Mr. Bush assembled all the black realtors in the area that night, and he's like, what are we going to do? And they made the decision to appeal all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And that's what happened. They got to the Supreme Court. By this point, Thurgood Marshall and his crew were there to help, and they were there to, Thurgood Marshall argued the case in front of the Supreme Court. So those are the facts. So what's the issue? The issue here is whether or not the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prevented the state from enforcing these restrictive covenants. The holding. The court ruled that yes, enforcing these restrictive covenants violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So what's the reasoning? Well, the court said, look, if it was just a matter of the restrictive covenants, that is private action, therefore it's not under the purview of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. But when you ask the state to enforce this law, then now that has become state action. And now it's something else. And therefore it is under the purview of the 14th Amendment. And to ask the court to enforce this based upon race is a violation of the 14th Amendment. Of course, the other side was like, well, black people could have a restrictive covenant. And so the court's like, look, just because you can have this exchange of discrimination doesn't make it right. It's wrong. And if you're asking the court to enforce it, then that is a violation. And therefore the restrictive covenants are not enforceable under the 14th Amendment, or at least not enforceable in the courts under the 14th Amendment. Now, I forgot to mention that the court's decision here was unanimous, kinda. 3 justices actually had to recuse themselves, Justice Jackson, Justice Reed, and Justice Rutledge, because they lived in neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants. So they were like, oh, you know what, let me not get involved in this because I kind of like these things. That's me talking. But they recused themselves, and the remainder of the court unanimously decided that this was unconstitutional. Whether or not the other 3 would have ruled that way, I don't know. Now, the Shelley home eventually became a historic landmark. You can go there and visit it today, and it has the plaque and speaks of the importance of this particular home. If you're ever in St. Louis, Missouri, when Outside opens up, you might want to check that out. So why is this case important? Well, it's important because of what the Shelleys did, as well as Mr. Bush and his conspiracy of heroes, we are able to live wherever we want to so long as we can afford it. And while, yes, I don't deny that there's still a racial caste system within our communities. I mean, most people know that there's a street in town where you go over it, you're in the black part, you go to the other side, you're in the white part. But as far as that being allowed legally, de jure segregation in that way is no longer permitted. And that's because of this case. So now we can theoretically live wherever we want to so long as we can afford it. And that's because of the work that they did. But I also think that it's important because when I think of acquiring property and being able to buy land wherever you choose, that also speaks to wealth, because we know that wealth is tied into property. And so what this case does is not just say you can live wherever you want to, but it's also saying, and your ability to acquire wealth in a particular way shall not be restricted because of your race. And so I think that's also important. It speaks to not just living arrangements, but ability for economic growth, and that should not be hindered. I would also say that I think this, and it's tied into my previous point, property rights are so fundamental to being an American. At least that's kind of one of the things that I learned from law school, is that being able to be a property owner is so fundamental to having the American dream. And this case removes the restrictions of that, which then makes being able to achieve the American dream, whatever that actually may be, more obtainable for Black people. Not just Black people, because in this case, it wasn't just Black people who were restricted, but Asians as well. So the Shelley versus Kraemer case allows for the possibility for really, truly, in almost anyone, if they want to be able to take hold of the American dream, so far as it's tied into property ownership. Of course, it could be more complicated than that, but I think that's the key point to when people think about the American dream and what does it mean to succeed. It entails property and owning property, land. And this case, it removes some of the barriers. Granted, they're still there, but this case at least removed some of the barriers, and I think that's why it's so important. If you would like to know more about this case or read up more about it, there is a book by Jeffrey Copeland. It's called Olivia's Story: The Conspiracy of Heroes Behind Shelley versus Kraemer, where he really goes into this story and the history and the different facets that make up the Shelley versus Kraemer decision. There's also a documentary. I may leave a link in the caption below, so you want to check that out. If you like this video, please be sure to hit the like button, whether that's a heart or a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. Please be sure to share this video wherever you can. Education is important, and I'm all about educating people, so please share. If you haven't already, please be sure to follow me on Facebook. It's Paluki's World Productions. You can follow me on Instagram at Paluki's World. I'm on Twitter at Paluki's World. Please be sure to follow my YouTube page, which I believe is just Brooke Girly. I also have a blog. It's palukisworld.com. If you go there and subscribe, you'll never miss a video or article I post. And so you definitely want to do that. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, I'm going to be in this era. I know last week I said like the civil rights era, but technically this whole series covers what I consider the civil rights era. But when I say the civil rights era, I mean like what we traditionally think of as the civil rights movement. So I'm going to be heavily in there, bouncing around from like the 40s to the 60s. So come back next week to see where I will be. Where will I be in the 50s, 40s, or 60s? I don't know. You all be safe in the meantime. Take care and God bless.